When I walked back into Harlan County, I told myself I wasn't nervous. I lied. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my stomach was doing something else entirely. That low, slow roll you get when your body remembers something your brain has spent years trying to forget. The kind of feeling that lives in muscle and bone, not thought. I hadn't been back in 11 years. 11 years, 4 months, and some change that I stopped counting around year 3 when counting started to feel like a kind of self-harm. The town looked smaller than I remembered. That always happens, I think, when you leave a place young. You carry it in your memory at the scale it felt when you were powerless inside it. Enormous, inescapable, permanent. Then you come back as someone else entirely, and the whole thing fits in your windshield. I drove past the feed store my uncle used to own before my stepfather bought it out from under him. Past the diner where I used to work weekends at 15, where the owner, a woman named Lou who smelled like coffee and Marlboro Lights, once slipped me an extra $20 and said, "Baby, you work harder than anyone in this building, including me." Past the courthouse square where the same Confederate statue that was there when I was born was still standing, pigeons on its head, like nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. That was the problem. Let me go back. My mother married my stepfather when I was 7 years old. I remember the wedding mostly in flashes, a yellow dress I hated, cake that was too sweet, and the way my stepfather smiled at me across the reception hall. Not warmly, appraisingly. Like I was an item he hadn't decided whether to keep. His name was Gordan, not Gordan. Gordan, he was very particular about the spelling, which should have told everyone something about him right there. Gordan was what people in Harlan County called a man of standing. He owned property. He sat on the county commission. He coached youth football for 15 years and had a plaque on the wall of the rec center to prove it. He was the kind of man who was publicly kind and privately something else entirely. The kind of man small towns are very good at producing and very bad at seeing clearly. My mother was beautiful and a little lost when she married him. She'd raised me alone for 4 years after my biological father left, and I think she was tired in the particular way that single mothers of young children get tired. Bone deep, future-facing, afraid of the long road ahead. Gordan offered her security. He offered her the relief of not being alone. What she didn't understand at first was what the transaction actually cost. It didn't cost her much. He was careful with her, even affectionate for years. What it cost was me. I can't tell you there was one incident that started it, because there wasn't. It was ambient. It was the way he spoke to me versus the way he spoke to my younger half-sister, Bet, who was born when I was 9. Lighter somehow, warmer. Like language had a different temperature depending on who was receiving it. It was the way achievements at school got acknowledged differently depending on whose achievement it was. It was small. For years, it was small enough that I almost believed I was imagining it. Then I turned 16. I'd gotten a scholarship offer, a partial one from a university 3 states away, a summer program for students showing academic promise in sciences. It wasn't a full ride. It was 6 weeks, but it was mine, and I'd worked for it. And when I got the letter, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Like the future was a place I might actually be allowed to enter. I made the mistake of being happy about it at dinner. Gordan put his fork down very carefully. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I'd done something that inconvenienced the picture he had of how our household should run. "You're not going," he said. Just like that. No discussion. No question about what it was, what it meant, whether there was financial help available, whether my mother had thoughts on the matter. Just, "You're not going." My mother looked at her plate. That was the moment I understood the actual structure of the household I lived in, not the surface version, the one with the plaque on the rec center wall and the Christmas card photo, but the real one. I understood that my mother had made a choice, and that choice had been made a long time ago, and that I was not on the winning side of it. I went anyway. Not to the program. I never made it to the program. What happened was smaller and larger than that, simultaneously. I went to the library the next morning and I used the computer there. And I applied for every grant and scholarship I could find. And when Gordan found out what I'd been doing, the argument we had was the kind of argument that ends things. I don't need to describe everything that was said. I have replayed it enough times in my own head in the years since to know that some of it still has teeth. What I will say is that by the end of it, I had $40, a backpack, and a very clear understanding that I was no longer welcome in that house. I was 16 years old. The first 3 weeks, I slept on a cot in the back of the church where my friend Dara's mother worked as a secretary. Dara is still one of my closest friends, which tells you something about who she is. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask me to explain. She just said, "Come on," and brought me there. Her mother, who I will simply call Miss Fay because she deserves the dignity of a name in this story, fed me and didn't ask too many questions and slipped a Bible tract under my plate every morning that I took and folded small and put in my pocket without reading. It felt like the kindest possible way to offer comfort. After 3 weeks, Miss Fay's husband found out I was there, and the arrangement quietly ended. After that, it got harder. I won't walk you through every month of the next 3 years because this isn't that story exactly. The short version is, I survived. I worked. I made decisions that I'm not proud of, and some that I am. I finished high school through a GED program. I got into a university, a real one, not just a summer program, on a combination of scholarships, grants, and a loan I spent 7 years paying back. I studied environmental engineering. I graduated. I got a job with a federal contractor that worked on water systems infrastructure. I built a life that was mine, entirely, unapologetically mine. And then, 11 years after I left Harlan County, my mother's sister called me. My aunt, I'll call her Aunt Rose, and I had stayed loosely in touch over the years. She was not close with Gordan, which meant she occupied a kind of liminal space in the family, present but slightly quarantined. She sent me birthday cards. She called on Christmas. She knew the broad outlines of my life without knowing the details. She called me on a Tuesday in March, and her voice had that particular flatness that voices get when there's bad news being held at arm's length. My mother had died. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in the fall. Gone by February. I hadn't known. I hadn't been told until after she was already in hospice, and even then, the person who'd been meaning to reach out was Aunt Roz, not Gordan, which told me everything I needed to know about where the notification had fallen on his priority list. The funeral was that Saturday. I want to tell you I didn't go. I want to tell you I made the sensible choice, the self-protective choice, the choice that the version of me who had spent 11 years building something solid would have made. But grief doesn't run on logic. Grief runs on something older and less rational, something that doesn't care about self-protection. I needed to say goodbye to my mother. Even the version of my mother that had chosen her husband over her daughter. I still needed to say goodbye to her. I also needed to be there for legal reasons, though I didn't fully understand that yet. My husband, his name is Theo, I'll get to him, had been tracking something for about 8 months that I only partially understood at the time. Theo works for the federal government. That's as specific as I'll be for now. What I knew in a general sense was that Gordan's business interests in Harlan County had attracted a certain kind of attention. The kind that moves slowly, carefully, and doesn't announce itself. Theo didn't tell me everything. He's careful, professionally, and by disposition. What he told me was, if you're going, I'm coming with you, and I need you to trust me on the timing. I trusted him on the timing. We drove to Harlan County on a Friday night, checked into a motel 2 towns over under my name, and I lay awake most of the night listening to the highway and trying to remember how to breathe. The funeral was at the Baptist church my mother had attended since before I was born. I wore a dark navy dress because I didn't own anything black that still fit, and I walked in alone because Theo had his own entrance to make, and the timing, as he had said, was his department. The church was full. Harlan County turns out for funerals. It's one of the things I'd actually missed about the place. The way community shows up in grief. The way pews fill with people who knew your grandmother and your grandmother's grandmother, who can remember you as a child and who bear witness to the long arc of a life. There was something real and true about that underneath everything else. I sat in the back. I don't know how long it took Gordan to notice me. Maybe 10 minutes? Maybe less. I saw the moment it happened. I was watching him from 3 rows behind and to the left, and I saw his jaw tighten, saw him lean to say something to the man beside him, saw that man look back at me with an expression I recognized from childhood. Assessment. Calculation. The silent language of men who have decided they are the rules. After the service, in the gravel parking lot, in front of what I estimated to be 60 or 70 people, Gordan walked toward me. He looked older. He was older, we both were. But the particular quality of his aging was the kind that happens to men who have spent decades uncontested, settled into himself like something that had never been required to adapt. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a person who genuinely believed the outcome of this conversation was already determined. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "I had prepared for this. I had rehearsed in the car, in the motel room, in the 11 years of accumulated distance between who I'd been and who I was now. I had prepared for a lot of things." "She was my mother," I said. "You lost that claim a long time ago." He said it quietly enough that only the people immediately around us could hear, intimate almost. The way people deliver lines they've been holding for years. "You walked out on this family. You don't get to show up now and play the grieving daughter." "I didn't walk out," I said. "I was pushed." He smiled. It was the smile I remembered from the dinner table, from the scholarship letter, from every moment when he'd held something I needed and decided, slowly and without apparent effort, to close his hand around it. "You should leave," he said, "before this becomes something neither of us wants." I didn't move. He nodded at something behind me. I turned and there were two men I didn't recognize, not deputies, not in uniform, but standing the way men stand when they've been asked to stand somewhere. Positioned. Gordan hadn't come to this conversation unprepared either. "These gentlemen will be happy to help you find your car," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I have a legal right to be here. This is private property." He said it with such practiced ease that I understood he'd used this exact line before. "The church has a standing policy about disruptions at services. I'm sure you understand." There was a moment then. I need you to understand the weight of this moment. Where 60 or 70 people in that parking lot were watching, and not a single one of them said anything. Not one. Some of them had known me since I was a child. Some of them had known me before Gordan existed in our lives. And they stood there in the gravel and they watched, and their silence was the same silence that had always existed in this town. The silence that had allowed a man like Gordan to operate exactly as he pleased for 20-something years. The two men moved closer. "On what grounds?" I asked. "Trespassing," he said. "And I'll have you know that Sheriff Briggs is a personal friend of mine, so I'd advise you not to make this difficult." I had known before I came that this might happen. Theo had known before I came that this might happen. Theo had known. We had planned for it the way you planned for weather you can predict but can't prevent. You don't stop going outside, you bring an umbrella. They put my hands behind my back. I want to tell you I stayed perfectly calm. I want to tell you I felt nothing. That 11 years of distance had immunized me against the particular indignity of being handled like a problem in the town where you were born. I wasn't perfectly calm. There were tears on my face, though my voice was steady, which I think is its own kind of courage. "This is a mistake," I said. "The mistake," Gordan said, "was coming back." And that was when I heard the cars. 3 of them. Federal plates. They came into the parking lot slowly, unhurriedly, with the specific energy of people who have nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. They parked in a line and the doors opened and there were people in suits and people who were definitely not in suits. And at the center of all of it was my husband, in a jacket I recognized because I'd ironed it 2 days earlier, holding something in his hand. Theo walked toward Gordan with the specific pace of a man who is in no hurry because hurry would imply urgency. And urgency would imply that the outcome was in question. It wasn't in question. It had not been in question for quite some time. "Sir," he said to Gordan, "my name is Agent Theodore Marsh. I'm with the Office of Inspector General, and I have some paperwork I'd like to go over with you." Gordan's face did something complicated. "I don't know who you think you are," he started. "I know exactly who I am," Theo said pleasantly. "I also know exactly who you are. I've known for about 8 months. The county commission contract irregularities are the interesting part, but honestly, the land deed manipulation is what's going to make the better case. The prosecutors thought so too when we briefed them last week. The 2 men who had been holding my arms were no longer holding my arms. I became aware, in the strange heightened clarity of that moment, that the parking lot had gone absolutely silent. 60 or 70 people, and not a sound, not a shoe on gravel, not a cough. The silence was different now from what it had been a minute ago. Before, it had been the silence of complicity, of people keeping their heads down. Now it was the silence of a town watching the architecture of the thing it had lived inside for 20 years begin, quietly and irrevocably, to come apart. Gordan looked at me. I think he expected to find something on my face that he could use, fear or satisfaction, or any legible emotion that would make this about me rather than about him. I'd thought about what I wanted to feel in this moment, in the car, in the motel room, in all the years of quiet preparation. I'd thought I would want to feel triumphant. I'd thought I might feel angry. I thought I might feel relief. What I actually felt was tired and sad. Genuinely sad. Not for Gordan. I want to be clear about that. But for the parking lot full of people who had watched a man behave exactly as he'd always behaved and had never once made a different choice. For my mother, who was in a casket inside that church and could not see any of this and would not have known what to do with it if she could. For the 16-year-old version of me who had stood in a kitchen with $40 and a backpack and been told, in every possible way a person can be told without the words being said, that she didn't matter enough to fight for. "You planned this," Gordan said. He was looking at me, not at Theo. His voice had lost its texture. It sounded, for the first time in my memory, like the voice of someone who is afraid. "I planned to attend my mother's funeral," I said. "That's all I planned." Theo touched my arm gently. "We need to have a longer conversation with Mr. Gordan," he said. "But first, are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. He looked at me. "I will be," I said. I stayed for another 2 hours. I went back inside the church after the parking lot cleared of federal vehicles and county vehicles and shocked neighbors. I sat with Aunt Roz, who held my hand through the last of the service and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. I looked at my mother's photograph on the program, a picture from before I was born, before Gordan, before all of it. A young woman standing in a field somewhere with her hair loose and her face turned towards something outside the frame. And I said whatever needed to be said inside myself. Then I went back to the motel, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in a very long time. I'm not telling you this story because it ends with everything being fixed. I want to be honest with you about that. Gordan's legal situation is ongoing, and I'm not at liberty to say more than that. The inheritance. My mother had, quietly, without telling anyone, updated her life insurance policy 2 years before she died, and I was still listed as a beneficiary. Gordan had apparently not known this, or had not known to check, which was, as my attorney put it, a significant oversight on his part. That piece has moved slowly through the necessary channels and is close to resolution. But fixed is not the right word for any of it. My mother is still gone. The years I spent not knowing her, the conversations we didn't have, the relationship we might have rebuilt if circumstances had been different. Those don't come back. There's a version of this story where the ending is triumphant and clean, and I walk out of Harlan County with my chin up and everything sewn together. That's not quite the version I'm living. What I actually walked away with was smaller and stranger than triumph. It was the feeling of having shown up, of having driven back into a place that had taught me I didn't belong, and standing in the parking lot and refusing to leave. Not because I was brave, exactly. I was terrified, if we're being honest. But because there are moments when the cost of not showing up is higher than the cost of whatever happens if you do. Theo met me for dinner that night at a diner 2 towns over. The kind of place where the pie is homemade and the coffee comes in a brown mug with no handle, and we sat across from each other in a vinyl booth and didn't talk about any of it for the first 20 minutes. Just ate. Because sometimes the most useful thing a person can do after something enormous has happened is to sit quietly and eat a meal. Then he looked at me across the table and said, "How are you?" And I said, "I don't know yet." And he said, "Okay, that's it. That's the whole of what passed between us." And it was, somehow, exactly enough. I drove home the next morning with the windows down even though it was cold, because I needed the air on my face, needed the physical sensation of moving forward through something. The hills flattened out as I got further from Harlan County, and the sky went wide and gray and featureless in the way that early spring skies do. That particular shade that isn't quite winter and isn't quite anything else yet. I've thought a lot in the months since about what I would say to the 16-year-old version of myself if I could. Not advice exactly. She needed practical things more than wisdom. And wisdom handed down to a teenager is mostly just noise anyway. But if I could just sit with her for a minute, in whatever library or church back room or parking lot she was trying to survive that week, I think I would tell her that the version of this story she could imagine from there, the one where she got out, where she built something, where she came back and stood her ground in broad daylight in front of everyone who had ever looked through her. That version was real. that it was going to happen, that she was already on the way there, even if from where she was sitting it looked like nothing at all. I've turned this story over in my head more times than I can count, trying to find the clean moral at the center of it. The tidy lesson that makes sense of everything. I haven't found one. What I've found instead is something messier and more honest than a lesson. A pattern. The way certain choices compound over time, quietly. The way interest accumulates in an account you forgot you had. Gordan made choices for 20 years, small ones and large ones. He chose to push a 16-year-old out of her home rather than allow her autonomy. He chose to surround himself with people who owed him things. He chose to build his sense of power on the silence of others. Each choice must have felt, in the moment, like maintenance, like simply keeping the structure he'd built intact. What he didn't account for was that structures built on that kind of foundation don't stay intact forever. They just look like they do, until the day they don't. And I made choices too. I chose to survive when surviving was genuinely hard, and the easier thing would have been to collapse into the story he'd written for me. The one where I was difficult, ungrateful, gone, and forgotten. I chose to build something real instead of spending my energy on resentment, which is its own kind of trap, maybe the most elegant one. Resentment keeps you connected to the thing that hurt you. It gives the other person continued residence in your head, rent-free, for years. I didn't always manage to avoid it. I won't pretend I spent 11 years serene and unbothered, but I kept choosing forward. That choice, made over and over and over again in ordinary moments with no audience and no applause, is what made everything else possible. What I want to say to anyone watching this who is in the middle of something that feels inescapable is this. The people who try to diminish you are almost always doing it because they understand, on some level, that you have something they don't. Not money, not status, something interior, a quality of self that can't be taken away, only temporarily suppressed. Gordan understood that about me before I understood it about myself. That's why he worked so hard, so early, to make me small. It didn't work. It delayed things, yes. It cost me years and relationships and a kind of ordinary childhood ease that I'll never fully recover. But it didn't work. The version of intelligence that actually serves you in life is not the kind that gets you gold stars in school. Though that kind has its uses, it's the kind that lets you read a situation clearly, plan without telegraphing, and act when the moment calls for it rather than when emotion is loudest. Theo has that quality in abundance, and I've learned a great deal from watching how he moves through the world. But I had my own version of it too. Quieter and harder one, built out of years of having to figure things out without a safety net. Gordan froze in that parking lot not because Theo was powerful, though Theo is formidable, but because he had spent 20 years believing that power was something you inherited or purchased or intimidated out of other people. He had never considered that a 16-year-old girl standing under a highway overpass with $40 was already, in every way that mattered, more powerful than he was. She just needed time to arrive at a place where that power was visible to everyone else. I think about that girl sometimes. I think about what she needed. Practically, yes, food and shelter and safety, but also just someone to say, you're not the problem here. You were never the problem. If you're that person right now, younger or older, in whatever parking lot your life has placed you in, I need you to hear it. You are not the problem. You never were,